Now, move on to the period after the firearm incident in the kitchen. At the time, I realized that for my self-preservation and the safety of my son, I had to move out of the house and get out of that marriage as soon as possible. 3 days later, I had accommodation and we moved out. Suddenly, the man found Jesus and wanted me back so that we could patch up a marriage that should never have happened. I didn't budge. He took an overdose of harmless sleeping pills. I didn't budge. He called in his mother so that she could explain my duty as a Christian wife to me. I didn't budge. He called in the big canon, the church minister. I went for a counseling session with this holy man who had no time to help me over the previous months. I sat there while this man of the cloth told me that it was my Christian duty to mend my ways and make my husband happy. He told me that the very last thing I should consider was a divorce, because such an act would in retrospect turn my holy marriage, as well as my marriage vows, into legalized prostitution, and in effect make me a prostitute. The husband was sitting there, nodding like one of these dogs that people used to put on the dashboards of their cars, and grinning whenever the minister scored another point. I got up and I walked out, away from the husband, the minister, the church council, the Sunday school, the congregation, the Bible, and God. This happened in a relatively small town. In the ensuing weeks, members of the congregation would see me walking in the street and cross the street so that they wouldn't need to have contact with me. Not a single nod, friendly or otherwise. Not a single phone call. Nothing. Not from the minister, not from the other members of the church council. I was as good as dead in the eyes of these people. A few months after this counseling session, the minister went fishing and broke his leg. I had no self-confidence, but I had a good job and I could at least financially take care of myself and my son. I tolerated this ostracism for about another year, and then found another job and moved away to a different part of the country. This is how my journey of finding my spiritual path began. I realized very quickly that I couldn't walk away from God because God was inside me. I realized what I had discovered in that church building and in the congregation had nothing to do with a loving God. God was back in my life, but no Bible. Why had I not noticed the violence and the improbable stories before? Who cared about how many details I could recall and quote? No prayer. It suddenly felt pretentious and artificial. And no circle of like-minded friends with the same values. I was alone in a desert. I decided to attend another church in a different language. And I joined the choir, which I enjoyed because I like singing. However, the void and the disillusionment were still there. There was yet another crisis with my mother where I found myself in the middle of very nasty events. I didn't cause the events, I didn't contribute to them, and I couldn't stop them. But I was the focal point because my mother was incredibly manipulative and convinced even professionals that I was the source of all her mental and emotional issues. Again, I approached a man of the cloth, this time in a different language, for spiritual guidance out of this quagmire. He listened with one ear, prayed for me, and reminded me that my tithe was due. After that, I turned my back on all religion, and I decided that I would live with the loneliness rather than the hypocrisy and doubts. Since I was so far off my Christian path, I decided during a few additional critical turns in my life to do the unthinkable and the most sinful thing I could imagine. I consulted various psychics. These psychics understood where I was coming from. They didn't judge me. They did ask questions, but even so, they knew a lot more about me, my life, and the people close to me than they could research at the drop of a hat. This was long before the time of social media. And they were upfront about their fees with no guilt trips and no conditions. Fascinating stuff. Here's a question for you. What experiences have you had with spirituality and the occult?